Jude Kirton Darling MEP. Today you're organising a meeting for those UK citizens who were denied a vote in the UK referendum and indeed in general elections because they've been out of the country, out of the UK for the last 15 years. What has the Parliament got to say about the situation?
Well, the European Parliament has a lot to say about it, partly because these are people who have exercised their right to move freely within the European Union. So we as members of the EU have given our citizens the right to live, work and study elsewhere in the EU. But at the same time, the 15-year rule in terms of rights to vote as a British citizen outside the UK then kicks in, which basically disenfranchises people who are exercising EU rights to travel and live abroad. So the European Parliament has a lot to say about it. We are defenders of democracy, and over the years, Parliament has taken quite a strong line in terms of promoting the enfranchisement of the population.
David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, proposed that those who had not received, who were not able to vote, should be allowed that right to vote. And then it didn't introduce it, but then held a referendum. Do you think this would make a major difference to any future vote? I imagine that those British citizens living and working in the EU would remain voters largely.
Not necessarily. David Cameron did promise ahead of the 2010 general election and 2015 that the Tory government would repeal the 15-year rule. He went out and he campaigned in UK migrant communities around Europe, trying to garner the votes of people who could still vote, claiming that the Tories would enact this. There were even suggestions that if there was a referendum, because in the same election in 2015 the Tories were promising a European referendum as well, that those people would get a vote in the referendum. So many people in goodwill will have voted for the Conservatives, thinking that it would be a way of ensuring their long-term voting rights, only to have the rug pulled out from underneath them. And part of what was said in the Petitions Committee today was the real bitterness and frustration from UK nationals living longer than 15 years elsewhere in the EU on the fact that politicians have made these promises and then have not delivered them. Now, it's not the government who are implementing that manifesto promise, but there is a private members' bill going through Westminster which would see the end of the 15-year rule, and it seems to be garnering the government's support. But there's no reason why Cameron couldn't have extended the franchise in 2016 to UK nationals elsewhere in the EU. That would have been in line with the franchise which was offered in the Scottish referendum, for example, where EU nationals were allowed to vote in the UK. They weren't allowed to vote in the EU referendum, and it would have allowed them to extend the vote to those communities across Europe, including the UKIP voters who live in the south of Spain.
Some people would like to see a second vote on the outcome of these negotiations on future relationship between the EU-27 and the UK. Do you think, firstly, that that is a possibility? And secondly, that the people who were disenfranchised for the EU referendum will have the chance to vote if there was a second vote?
I think the possibility of a people's vote on the final Brexit deal, is definitely increasing. That's partly because the lies of the Brexit campaign are increasingly being exposed, but also people are seeing what the reality of a future EU-UK relationship will be, and many people are now, and opinion polls show there is public support for people to have a final say, a people's vote on that final deal. So I think the possibility is increasing. The private members' bill, which is going through Westminster, which would scrap the 15-year rule, unfortunately explicitly doesn't include the language about referendum. So it talks about general elections, but it doesn't talk about referendum. And what we need to see is that if there is a people's vote on the final deal in the Brexit negotiations, that those people who are the most affected by Brexit, UK nationals living elsewhere in the EU and EU nationals living in the UK, should undoubtedly be part of the franchise. They should have a vote on a decision which affects their lives far more than it affects many other people's lives.